If and they was really a God who loved us and wanted to be with us forever and who was willing to literally die for us so's we could be together, then the evidence for his existence would be so overwhelming that they wouldn't even be no atheists. He'd be a constant, tangible presence in the lives of every person on Earth. Apologists ain't got that kind of evidence, though, so they has to try and bamboozle folks with advanced theoretical physics that even Stephen Hawking had to struggle with. And they wouldn't have to do that if God was actually real. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by Dr. William Lane Craig. We's going through Dr. Craig's argument from fine-tuning, which I like to call the argument from find-tuning, F-I-N-D, on account of how Christian and Muslim apologists is so bound and determined to find some kind of intentional tuning there. And of course, that's more commonly known as confirmation bias. If you sets out to find something that you's absolutely convinced has to be there, there's a pretty good chance you's going to find it whether there's anything there or not. Just ask a flat earther if they's got any evidence that the earth is really flat. But anyways, Dr. Craig started out talking about ancient Greek philosophers and how they assumed that if in the world we see today seems all ordered and rational, why that must be the work of the gods. And of course, that ain't an actual explanation on account of it don't describe any measurable, predictable, verifiable processes by which these gods supposedly created all this order and stuff. It's a simple creation myth that takes real-world characteristics and gives the credit for them to some kind of magical, unfalsifiable, arbitrary beings. And I want to take a look back at one particular quote from Plato that Dr. Craig mentioned, or rather he paraphrased it, and it goes like this, quote, Plato concluded that there must be a best soul who is the maker and father of all, the king who ordered the primordial chaos into the rational cosmos that we observe today, end quote. And notice specifically that phrase, primordial chaos. This harkens back to the creation myths that many ancient cultures shared about the universe originally being a dark, chaotic realm, often manifested as endless, restless waters, storm-tossed and violent. In ancient Mesopotamia, they gave these waters a name and called her Tiamat, the mother of the Babylonian gods who gets slain by the storm god Marduk, who then constructs the material universe out of her remains. And some scholars think that there may be traces of the legend of Tiamat in the early texts of the book of Genesis, especially the description of the primordial world being a dark and restless sea, and the description of God putting lights in the sky to demark the seasons, just like Marduk used parts of Tiamat's body to make stars in the sky to demark the seasons. And the reason I bring this up is just to point out that this notion of primordial chaos is a common feature of ancient pagan mythology and not something that has any scientific evidence to support it. It's a story that is 100% invented out of the imaginations of primitive folks. And it's kind of easy to understand how folks might want to imagine something like that. If and there was a time before the universe existed, we'd expect things to be different than what we see today. So, since we see order in life and physical laws today, we'd expect that before the universe existed, there'd be disorder and violence and chaos. But fortunately, we now know for a fact that this primordial chaos never existed. If and we follow the space-time continuum back through time to its initial boundary, all we have is an ordered universe. And I'll let Dr. Craig explain once again why it'd be a mistake to suppose that there was chaos prior to that initial boundary. Quote, notice that there's simply nothing prior to the initial boundary of space-time. Let's not be misled by words, however. When I say there is nothing prior to the initial boundary, I do not mean that there is some state of affairs prior to it and that is a state of nothingness. That would be to treat nothing as though it were something. Rather, I mean that at the boundary point, it is false that there is something prior to this point. End quote. And this is exactly correct. There was no state of affairs prior to the earliest moment of time. Not a state of nothingness and not a state of chaos. And just like this rules out the possibility of the universe ever having been created, it also rules out the possibility of the physical constants of the universe ever having been chaotic and random. The material universe, as it exists today, has existed with its current physical laws and constants for as long as time itself has existed. Or in other words, there has never been a time when the physical laws and constants has ever been any different. Local conditions has changed over time, but they's always operated in accordance with the same physical laws and constants. And that means that Dr. Craig has already ruled out the fine-tuning argument back in his chapter on the cosmological argument. There was no prior state of chaos in which the physical constants of the universe was up for grabs and had to be nailed down by some supernatural intelligent mind. And yet, Christians and Muslims persist in believing that they was. It's almost ironic because they also believe that before the beginning of time there was a state of complete nothingness, which contradicts the belief that there was a state of complete chaos. And yet, somehow, Dr. Craig manages to believe in primordial chaos and that God created the universe out of nothing, all while acknowledging that it is false to say that there was anything prior to the earliest moment of time. That's messed up, but that's what happens when a smart feller wants to believe in God. And what's worse, he wants to convince other folks to believe in the same garbled nonsense as he does. So what does he do? He falls back on the time-honored verbal prestidigitation beloved by creationists everywhere. Big numbers. Quote, the number of seconds in the entire history of the universe is around 10 to the power of 17. That is 1 followed by 17 zeros. 1 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0. The number of subatomic particles in the entire known universe is said to be around 10 to the power of 80. 1 followed by 80 zeros. End quote. Big numbers, therefore God. I mean, he ain't quite got around to making that specific claim yet, but it's easy to see where he's headed. But just in case big numbers alone ain't enough to impress us, Dr. Craig also tosses in that all-time favorite of creationists, the quotation out of context. Quote, Roger Penrose of Oxford University has calculated that the odds of that low-entropy states existing by chance alone is on the order of 1 chance out of 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123, a number that is so incomprehensible that to call it astronomical would be a wild understatement. End quote. Dr. Craig is referencing a discussion that Dr. Penrose included on pages 339 through 345 of the 1989 edition of his book, The Emperor's New Mind. And someone on the internet was kind enough to post that passage on the web for the rest of us to read, and I'll put a link in the description so you can read it too. Now, the way Dr. Craig presents it makes it sound as if a low-entropy universe is essentially impossible without some kind of intelligent, purposeful intervention. But he's leaving out a few important points. One is that this calculation is based on the assumption that the universe actually emerged from the inside of a ginormous black hole somehow. And that's a highly speculative assumption, to put it kindly. But more importantly, he's leaving out Penrose's conclusion that if the universe did come out of some kind of black hole, there must be some unknown physical factor that constrains the values he's using in his calculations. Dr. Craig is appealing to the common creationist false dichotomy of assuming that there's only 2 possible options, either random chance or divine creation. And that ain't what we find in the real world. Genuinely random phenomena are actually incredibly rare and difficult to produce even when we want genuine randomness. But Dr. Penrose ain't saying that the low entropy of the early universe was the result of randomness. He's saying it looks like there's some new factor that we don't know about that's producing an effect that we wasn't expecting. The great discoveries of science ain't heralded by somebody hollering, Eureka, but by somebody saying, that's odd. That's just how science works. But that ain't how creationism works, of course, and Dr. Craig rushes to declare victory after only this one single example. Quote, the examples of fine-tuning are so many and so various that they aren't likely to disappear with the advance of science. Like it or not, fine-tuning is just a fact of life that is scientifically well established. End quote. But that's a misleading framing. The fact of life that's scientifically well established is that the physical constants of the universe is precise. And that's amazing enough in and of itself. Accurate to within 1 part out of 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123 is indeed mind-bogglingly precise. Science is a never-ending source of wonder and fascination, if you do it right. But precision ain't the same thing as fine-tuning. The phrase fine-tuning smuggles in the unsupported assumption that some kind of purposeful intention was involved somehow, and that ain't anything that has any scientific basis. It's a purely superstitious bias. And needless to say, using the assumption of purposeful intention in order to prove purposeful intention is circular reasoning. Well, having rested his case after only a single quote line with big numbers he can use in a false dichotomy, Dr. Craig moves on to trying to answer what he sees as the most likely objections. Quote, now some of you might be thinking, but if the constants and quantities had had different values, then maybe different forms of life might have evolved. But that underestimates the truly disastrous consequences of a change in the value of those constants and quantities. End quote. And credit where credit is due, I think this is a fair representation both of the common objection and a reasonable rebuttal to that objection. We ain't speculating about hypothetical changes that might shift evolution over from preferring carbon-based life to preferring silicon-based life. We speculating about hypothetical changes that would prevent stars from forming, or that would immediately recollapse the entire universe into a black hole. And them ain't conditions that's going to allow for much that would come anywhere near what we mean when we use the word life, let alone intelligent life. But on the other hand, who cares whether we can speculate about imaginary catastrophic changes that would violate the physical nature of reality? Fantasy ain't reality, and imagining impossible scenarios don't make them possible, let alone likely. So both the objection and the rebuttal is moot points. Dr. Craig goes on to address a second objection, which I ain't never heard of, but I suppose some folks might be making it. Quote, sometimes people will object, but maybe in a universe governed by different laws of nature, such disastrous consequences might not result. But this objection betrays a misunderstanding of the argument. We're not concerned with universes governed by different laws of nature. We have no idea what such universes might be like. Rather, we're concerned solely with universes governed by the same laws of nature, but with different values of the constants and arbitrary quantities. End quote. But two things here. One is that the constants and quantities of the universe ain't arbitrary. There's physical factors that go into making them what they is, and that's kind of the whole point that Dr. Penrose was making in his calculations about the initial entropy of the universe. Correct application of the scientific method can lead to the discovery of the existence of things even before we know exactly what them things is. And that's way cool. Secondly, what is arbitrary is the argument that Dr. Craig is making here. It is no more implausible for the physical laws to be different than it is for the physical constants to be different. Dr. Craig is insisting that we can only talk about changes to the one and not the other, because that's what's convenient for his rhetorical goals. But the physical laws of the universe don't exist in isolation from the physical constants and quantities of the universe. These are all just different aspects of the nature of the material universe. Whether you change the laws or whether you change the constants and quantities, you're redefining the nature of the universe. And you can't force the nature of the universe to change just by imagining different things about it. So this whole argument is just an exercise in human imagination, not a scientific exploration of the meaning of the universe. Of course, Dr. Craig being Dr. Craig, he can't resist presenting the fine-tuning argument in the form of a syllogism. So here goes. Quote, 1. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. 2. It is not due to physical necessity or chance. 3. Therefore, it is due to design. End quote. So right off the bat, premise 1 is misstated. If we want to be strictly accurate, the most we can say is that the physical laws, constants, and quantities of the universe contain precise values. But that leaves fine-tuning completely out of the picture, and that leaves the rest of the syllogism with nothing to work with. So let's rephrase premise 1 so that it includes the words fine-tuning without sacrificing accuracy. If we do that, premise 1 comes out as follows. 1. The apparent fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, design, or confirmation bias on the part of those who's predisposed to believe that the universe has an intelligent and purposeful creator. Okay, so that's a lot better. That gives us a huge improvement in the accuracy of the premise. So now we can move on to premise 2, which is the claim that it ain't due to physical necessity or chance. And Dr. Craig starts with the possibility of physical constants being the result of physical necessity. Quote, now on the face of it, this alternative seems fantastically implausible. It would require us to say that a life-prohibiting universe is a physical impossibility. But why take such a radical view? The constants are not determined by the laws of nature, so why couldn't they be different? End quote. And the short answer is, because of these constants. That's what constant means. A constant value is a value that can't be different. So there's that. But another way to look at it is that the physical constants is observations, not configurations. That is to say, we don't set the constants of the universe to arbitrary values and then apply physical laws to them. We make observations of how the universe works and then summarize our observations by describing them in terms of mathematical equations. And the physical constants we find is part of that summary. We don't arbitrarily pick a gravitational constant and then build the law of gravity around it. The gravitational constant emerges as part of the formula that describes that law. It ain't that natural laws don't determine the constants, it's that the constants is a component of the natural law. Saying that natural laws don't determine the physical constants is like saying that atoms ain't made of atoms. Okay, technically true, but so what? Maybe there's more left for us to discover. Maybe some future scientist or mathematician will discover some other physical factor or factors that goes into determining the value of a given physical constant. And that's fine. I'm okay with agreeing that we don't know what them other factors might be. But we don't need to. What we know about the real world is that certain precise constants is inherent in the nature of the material universe and has been for all of time. For each physical constant in the universe, that's a range of possible values of exactly 1. And if the range of possible values only contains a single value, the odds of that constant having that value is 100%. And of course, it ain't the least bit implausible for something to be true if there's a 100% chance of it being true. Dr. Craig goes on to gloat about the fact that so far we ain't got a so-called theory of everything that unites gravity, electromagnetism, the strong force, and the weak force. And he claims that even if we did, it wouldn't explain why physical constants has the values that they has. Plus, he brings up string theory and gloats about how many unanswered questions still remain, and yada yada yada. But all that goes to show is that there's a lot about the fundamentals of the physical universe that we still ain't discovered yet. There's still big gaps in our knowledge that Dr. Craig can try and fit a God into. And good for him, but it's still a God of the gaps argument when it comes right down to it. And he concludes with, quote, So there's no evidence that a life-permitting universe is physically necessary. Quite the contrary, all the evidence indicates that life-prohibiting universes are not only possible, but far, far more likely than any life-permitting universe. End quote. But this is false. Some folks has done some calculations that indicate that one or more life-prohibiting universes is theoretically possible, but that's a long ways away from proving that such universes is actually possible. And on the other hand, we know that life-permitting universes is possible because we live in one. That ain't just speculation, it's a verifiable fact. So if we's going to avoid implausible speculations and stick to what we can verifiably know, the most we can say is that we know life-permitting universes is possible and that physical constants has values that, as far as we know, is the only values they can have. So the claim that this universe is implausible is just groundless personal incredulity. He then takes up the possibility of the physical constants and quantities of the universe being the result of random chance, and that gives him the chance to wave more big numbers around to distract us from the fact that he's just assuming, with no verifiable basis, that the physical constants is arbitrary and could be any value you can imagine for no reason. He uses the example of a lottery where billions and billions of black balls plus one white ball is placed in one of them spherical lottery cages that mixes up the balls and then dispenses them one at a time. And just to dramatize his little scenario, he says that if you get a black ball, you die. If you get a white ball, you live, but since there's billions and billions of black balls and only one white one, you'd better just go on ahead and make your will before you collect your ball. What his analogy overlooks is the fact that none of the black balls actually exists. The only ball in that cage that's actually real is the white one. Even if that cage contains an infinite number of imaginary black balls, your odds of actually getting the one real white ball is still 100%. And he's got a bunch more arguments to try here, but I think I'm going to put a bookmark in and save the rest for next time. Well, still, I think this is a good place to take a break and just review what all his arguments so far has in common. In every case, it's some variation of his lottery analogy. He takes the one real case that we know actually exists and adds in a whole bunch of imaginary cases that, as far as we know, only exist in the imagination. And then he says, look at how implausible it is that the one real possibility is the one that happened and not any of the imaginary possibilities. Well, yeah, that's because real things is 10 to the power of 10 to the power of a gazillion times more likely to be true than the imaginary ones. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, we're going to finish up Dr. Craig's attempt to argue for the so-called fine-tuning of the universe. And even though so far he's just been finding different ways of saying the same thing over and over again, there's actually going to be some new material to cover there. So stay tuned. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.